Malcolm forgave the man who took 17 years of his life on a Tuesday afternoon in September 2018 in the car park of a supermarket in Wolverhampton, and the whole thing took about 4 minutes. He was sitting in a grey Astra in a bay near the trolley shelter, with the engine off and a shopping list on the passenger seat in his own handwriting. Bread, batteries, cat food, bin bags. He had not driven there to do this. He had driven there for the batteries. There was no ceremony. Nobody was told. He did not pray, and he is not religious now, whatever he may have been before. He did not write anything down, and he did not cry, and when he had finished, he went inside and bought the 4 things on the list, and came out, and drove home and had his tea. The man he forgave is called Terry. Terry has never apologised. Terry has never been in contact. Terry does not know that any of this happened, and at the moment it was happening he was, as far as anybody can establish, about 11 miles away in Dudley, where he still lives, and where he has lived undisturbed throughout. Here are the facts, stated plainly, because the mechanism makes no sense unless the size of the thing is clear. In March 1995, Malcolm was convicted at Birmingham Crown Court on the strength of testimony given by Terry, who had known him for 9 years and who was lying, not mistaken, lying, with a motive, under oath at length and consistently enough to persuade 12 people. Malcolm was 32. He served 17 years and 4 months. The conviction was quashed in July 2012. What that cost? Itemised. His trade, because an electrician's registration, does not survive a 17-year gap, and neither does a working knowledge of the regulations. His mother, who died in November 1999 in a hospital in Walsall while he was 200 miles away, and who was buried without him because permission to attend was refused, and his daughter Nicola, who was 4 years old when he went in, and 21 when he came out, and whose entire childhood happened in another building. He kept every birthday card she sent him. There are 17 of them in a shoebox tied with string. The handwriting changes across them, and that is the record he has of her growing up. So this is not a story about a slight, or a betrayal that felt enormous at the time, or a family argument that hardened over years. Terry destroyed a life, deliberately, profited slightly, and has never once said sorry. And in a car park in 2018, Malcolm forgave him in about 4 minutes, and could not, if you asked him, tell you that he felt any warmer towards Terry afterwards than he had felt before. Which means almost everything most people believe about forgiveness must be wrong, because none of it fits what actually happened here. So before anything else, 4 things have to be cleared out of the way. Not as pedantry, because each one of them is a reason people conclude they cannot do this, when what they actually cannot do is the thing they have mistaken it for. It is not reconciliation. Nothing about it requires a relationship, a conversation, a meeting, or a card at Christmas. Malcolm has not spoken to Terry since 1995 and has no intention of ever doing so, and that is not a failure of the exercise. It is not even relevant to it. It is not excusing. It is not deciding the thing was smaller than it was, or that he had his reasons, or that anyone might have done the same in his position. Any process that requires the wrong to shrink is not forgiveness. That is revision. And it is a far worse bargain because it asks you to surrender the truth as well as the anger. It is not forgetting. Malcolm can give you the dates. He can give you the order of the questions in cross-examination in 1995. He remembers all of it, precisely, and expects to until he dies. And it does not require an apology. This is the one that traps people, and it traps them for decades, because if forgiveness requires the other person to participate, then the person who harmed you is holding the key to your own recovery, permanently, and may simply decline to hand it over, which most of them do. Which brings us to the distinction that does most of the work here, and that hardly anybody is ever taught. There are 2 entirely different things wearing the same word. The first is a decision. It is cognitive, it can be taken deliberately, and it can be taken in an afternoon. It is a resolution about how you intend to conduct yourself from this point, that you will not pursue revenge, that you will stop maintaining the case, that you are writing the debt off as uncollectible. And here is the important part. You can take that decision while still angry. You can take it while still, in some corner of yourself, wanting something bad to happen to him. The second is a feeling. It is the softening, the gradual loss of charge, the day you hear the name and notice that not much happens in your chest. That one cannot be decided. It cannot be scheduled or forced. It arrives slowly and unevenly, and sometimes it does not arrive at all. Almost everybody assumes the second is the real thing, and the first is a sort of pretending. It is the other way round. The decision is the act. The feeling is a possible consequence of the act, and a decision is not invalidated by its consequences not having turned up yet. You can decide to stop smoking on a Tuesday and still want a cigarette on the Friday, and nobody says you did not really decide. Malcolm's decision took 4 minutes in a Vauxhall. The feeling took another 2.5 years to arrive in any usable form. Parts of it have never arrived. He says he no longer expects them to, and that it has made no difference to anything. Which raises the obvious question. If Terry never knew, and nothing softened for 2.5 years, and no relationship resumed, and no apology was received, what exactly changed in that car park? To answer that, you have to be precise about what was actually harming him in 2018, because it was not the 17 years. The 17 years were finished. They had stopped in July 2012. By 2018, they were a completed historical event, as fixed and as unreachable as the Wars of the Roses. Nothing could be done to them, and this is the point, nothing was being added to them. What was still running was the trial, because Malcolm, like almost everybody in this position, had been conducting proceedings, not brooding, which undersells it considerably, prosecuting, in detail most days, for years. He had a cross-examination, he had refined across hundreds of iterations, he had a closing speech. He had, by his own estimate, something like 40 distinct versions of an encounter in a supermarket, in which Terry turned round and saw him, each with different dialogue, different weather, a different opening line, all of them rehearsed. He knew which road Terry lived on from 2014. He drove down it twice. He never stopped the car, and here is where this becomes medical rather than metaphorical. Rumination is not thinking. Thinking about a problem tends to travel towards a conclusion and then stop. Rumination is rehearsal, the same material cycled without resolution, and the body does not reliably distinguish rehearsal from occurrence. When somebody recalls a serious grievance the way Malcolm recalled his, blood pressure rises, heart rate rises, the muscles load, the stress response engages as though the event were arriving now. In studies where people are asked to hold a grudge in mind and then to adopt a forgiving stance towards the very same event, the physiological readings differ measurably between the two conditions, in the same person, minutes apart. Now multiply that by a decade of daily practice. He was not remembering 17 years. He was reserving them, in installments, in his own kitchen, at his own expense. Terry took 17 years, the trial took most of the next 6, and the trial was Malcolm's own work, performed by Malcolm, at a cost paid entirely by Malcolm, with no contribution from Terry whatsoever. Which is why the way this is usually sold is so badly wrong and does so much damage. Forgiveness is nearly always presented as generosity, a gift, something magnanimous you extend downwards to the person who wronged you, from a position of moral height. Anybody who has been seriously harmed hears that, and recoils, and they are right to. It is not only repellent, it is inaccurate. Terry receives nothing. Terry is not enriched, relieved, absolved, or even informed. His Wednesday was identical to his Monday. Nothing was transferred to him, because there was no mechanism by which anything could be. The honest framing, and Malcolm is unusually blunt about this, is self-interest. He did not do it for Terry. The suggestion irritates him. He did it because he was 55, because he had perhaps 25 usable years left if he was fortunate, and because he was spending a measurable portion of every single one of his remaining days on a man in Dudley who did not know he existed. It was, he says, a resource decision, and this has to be said clearly, because the alternative reading is genuinely dangerous. None of it has anything to do with accountability. Forgiveness is not a substitute for justice, and it does not stand in for it. Malcolm pursued his compensation claim hard, through 2013 and 2014 and 2015 and beyond, with lawyers and with considerable stubbornness, and sitting in a car park in 2018 changed not one thing about that. The two run on separate tracks. One concerns what the state owes him, the other concerns what he does with his own afternoons. And now, the part that has to be handled carefully, because there is a counterfeit version of all of this. It is extremely common, and it does real harm. In the autumn of 2012, 3 months out, Malcolm was told to forgive. Not asked. Told repeatedly, by people who loved him. A brother-in-law, 2 cousins, and most persistently, a congregation in Wolverhampton that had prayed for him throughout the 17 years and felt, not unreasonably, that it had some stake in the outcome. The phrases were the usual ones: you have to let it go. Bitterness will eat you alive. Don't let him take any more than he's already taken. Every one of those sentences is defensible in the abstract. All of them, delivered on that schedule, were a request for something else entirely, because what was actually being asked, and this is not a cynical reading, it is simply a description of what the demand accomplishes, was that he become easier to be around. His anger was legible and enormous, and it made every room heavier. Forgiveness, demanded at that point, is a request that the wrong person take responsibility for everybody else's discomfort. So he said the words in a church hall in November 2012, standing up to about 40 people. He said that he forgave Terry. He did not. He was nowhere near it. What he had done was perform a resolution in order to stop being asked for one, and the cost of that was not nothing. Premature forgiveness, pressed, borrowed, or said early to keep the peace, is measurably worse than doing nothing at all. It tracks with suppression rather than resolution. In ongoing relationships, it predicts repeated exposure to the same harm, because a person who has publicly absolved somebody finds it very hard to object the next time, and it erodes something structural, the sense that your own account of what happened to you is the authoritative one. Anger is not the obstacle at this stage. Anger is accurate perception. It is a mind correctly registering that a serious wrong has occurred, and it is doing a job. Skipping it does not remove it. It buries it while it is still moving. It took Malcolm the better part of 6 years to undo the sentence he spoke in that hall, because before he could mean anything, he had to privately withdraw something he had already said in public. So, the car park. 4 minutes. What actually happened? Here is the reframe, and it is the whole of it. Forgiveness is not something you feel, it is something you stop doing. Malcolm did not generate warmth towards Terry, because warmth cannot be generated on demand, and anybody who suggests otherwise is selling something. What he did was discontinue proceedings. He stopped conducting the trial. Note carefully what that does not mean. The verdict stands, in his head, permanently, and without revision. Terry did it, deliberately, and it was monstrous. That finding was never in question, and has never been softened by a single degree. What ended was the case, the daily hearings, the refined cross-examination, the 40 supermarket scenarios, the closing speech he had been polishing for years and was never going to deliver to anybody. All of it discontinued by the only person withstanding to discontinue it. Because the trial was only ever held in one place, one skull, one jurisdiction, no other participants, no defendant present, no jury, no listing, no clerk. Terry had never once been in the room. He had never been served, never attended, never been asked to plead, and never known that the court existed at all, which is precisely why it can be closed unilaterally. It requires no cooperation, because nobody else was cooperating. It requires no consent, because nobody else was consenting. And it requires no apology, because an apology is evidence, and evidence is only needed by a case that is still being heard. That is the mechanism. It is not spiritual, and it is not soft. It is jurisdictional, and it explains the single most confusing feature of the whole subject, how forgiveness can possibly work on somebody who is dead, or absent, or entirely unrepentant, or 11 miles away in Dudley watching the television. It works on them because it was never being done to them in the first place. He was the court. He adjourned it, indefinitely, and went in for the batteries. That is all 4 minutes buys. It turns out to be enough. And now, the honest part, which most accounts of this leave out, and the leaving out is exactly why so few people believe them. Nothing was restored. Say it flatly, because it matters. The 17 years are gone. They were not returned, redeemed, offset, or given meaning by anything that happened afterwards. His mother is still dead, he was still not there, and there exists no version of events in which he was. Nicola's childhood happened, in full, without him in it, and the relationship they have built since 2012, which is real and warm and includes a standing Sunday phone call at 6 o'clock, is not the relationship he would have had, it is a different one. A good one, not that one. His trade never came back. He started a course in 2014 and did not finish it. He works 3 days a week on the trade counter of a builder's merchant in Bilston, and he is very good at it, and it is not what he was. The compensation, when it eventually came, arrived after years of process and reduced by deductions, and it is not the subject of this video, but he will tell you without hesitation that it did not touch the sides. And Terry is alive. He is in his 60s. He lives in Dudley in a house with a blue door. He has never been prosecuted for the lie. He has never sent a letter. And he does not know that a man he has not seen since 1995 spent 4 minutes in a supermarket car park, releasing him from a debt he was never aware of having incurred. So the ending is not that it was worth it. Nobody should say that. 17 years is not made worth anything by a psychological maneuver in a parked car. The ending is smaller than that, and duller, and true. He had been paying for it twice, once when it happened, which he could not help, and once again every day afterwards, which, eventually, at 55, in a car park, in about 4 minutes, he could. He stopped paying the second one. That is the entire gain. It is not redemption, and it is not peace exactly. It is roughly 2 hours a day of a man's own attention handed back to him, after a very long time, which he now spends on the trade counter, and the Sunday phone call, and a cat called Dennis, and on Tuesdays, the shopping. And one last thing has to be said, because this is where discussions of this subject usually go wrong. None of it is owed by anybody. Nobody is obliged to do what Malcolm did. There is no moral duty to forgive. There is no good evidence that it is compulsory for a decent life, and there are people who carry a grievance to the end and are not diminished by having done so. That is a legitimate position, and it belongs to the person who is harmed, nobody else. If anyone has ever told you differently, on a timetable that happened to suit them, they were asking for something on their own behalf. The only claim being made here is narrower, and it is this. If you do decide you want to put it down, you will not need the other person's permission, participation, apology, or knowledge. The court is yours, the listing is yours, you were always the only one sitting in it. Malcolm got out of the car, went inside, and bought bread, batteries, cat food, and bin bags.